Hi, this is Diane Moss, and I'm founding director of the Renewables 100 Policy Institute. And welcome today, everybody, to this that I'm really looking forward to on resiliency and how the gas infrastructure and renewable gas solutions may address challenges and present opportunities on the path to carbon neutrality. And so we all, so many of us, certainly my colleagues here, and probably many who are on this listening in, we know we need to decarbonize. I think this is an internationally understood concept that we need to decarbonize. We need to decarbonize quickly across sectors, not just, renewable energy in the electricity sector, but all across the transportation, heating, cooling, industrial, all these. And how Renewables 100, we focused a lot on pushing the target of getting to 100% renewable decarbonized energy across sectors. And that was certainly an early part of our conversation. But what always really interested us was, how are we going to get there? And how are we going to get there reliably, efficiently, cost effectively, but also 24/7, 365 under all conditions. And that is an enormous challenge. But it's also very necessary, because energy makes everything work, and people, lives, quality of life, really depends on us having access to at least basic energy services all the time. I'm actually sitting in a place that was confronted with one of the big California wildfires. My own home was lost. I'm very aware in my community what it's like to not have energy services. And the threat that it can be inconvenient, but it can also be a threat to life. And I'm also aware that we have a lot of conversation about electrification, as we should. It's a very important part of the conversation. But in addition to electrons and our electric infrastructure, I think we also need to be talking about, what do we do with molecules in our gas infrastructure? I know where I sit, the gas system never went out during the big fire. The electric system went off for at least a week, and the gas system being on allowed certain essential services that kept people near and dear to me alive. I think we may need multiple. We need to think about, how do we optimize both all of this infrastructure that we have? How do we to make sure that we're covered, even, and how our most vulnerable are covered, whether that's in communities that don't have resources, or communities that are especially prone to disaster, and how we do that. So that's something that we're going to be talking about today. And I'm very excited that we have two people that I love talking with, and I think have really been thinking about this and have some very interesting ideas. One of them is Naeem Jonathan Perez from SoCalGas, and the other is Michael Colvin from the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF. And we're going to start today. They're both going to share some introductory remarks about what they've been working on, what they've been thinking about, and then we're going to dive into some discussion. And then we're going to have some time at the end for question and answer from the audience, because we'd like to hear what's on your mind, and try to answer those questions and keep the dialogue going. So without further ado, we're going to start with Jonathan. Go for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for the opportunity to present, and it's really an honor to be in a panel with my former colleague, Michael Colvin. For those of you who don't know, I joined SoCalGas just shy of a year ago from the Environmental Defense Fund, where Michael and I worked together, and to be in a panel with you, Diane, who's been such a pleasure to work with and get to know. Clearly, we live in a transformative time for energy and the environment, which presents huge implications for how we generate, transport, and store energy across all segments and all aspects of our lives. The scale of the next quarter century's energy transformation will exceed the Industrial Revolution and the transportation revolution combined. I think what can give us confidence is that in this evolution of energy, we all share a common objective of building a low carbon and ultimately net zero energy future. California, leading on the environment, has set ambitious climate goals. SoCalGas supports these goals. And last month, we announced our commitment to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions in our operations and delivery of energy by 2045. And to use the vernacular, our commitment includes scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. In other words, those of our customers. For decades, SoCalGas has been an energy innovator, and our net zero commitment is our boldest step yet. 3 facets of our commitment go to the heart of California's low carbon energy future and are applicable around the country. The first is integration. Electrification in transportation and buildings is essential to a decarbonized future, but electrification is not possible without the gas system supporting wind and solar when they are intermittent or otherwise not available. The function of the gas grid goes to the heart of today's resilience discussion. Number 2 is resiliency. Resiliency is different than reliability. Reliability is our energy system operating under standard conditions. Reliability is referenced 100 times in the Federal Power Act. Resiliency does not appear once, but it should. Resiliency is the system operating when conditions are anything but standard. Wildfires, mudslides, extensive persistent cloud cover, and prolonged cold weather. Because gas infrastructure is mostly underground, it's protected from events that compromise resiliency. Resiliency is vital, and as we decarbonize, we will need to define resiliency, design resiliency, and build resiliency into our energy system. And let's recognize that to decarbonize, demand for electric power in California is expected to double or more. Electric capacity, comprised primarily of renewables, is expected to more than triple. The net effect will be to raise the bar and the need for resiliency. Put another way, for every increment of new renewable capacity, there is a need for a commensurate increment of resiliency capability. In 2020, 12 of the highest 20 hourly gas delivery days on the SoCalGas system were serving electric generator load, several of which occurred during the August reliability challenges that we experienced in California in 2020. But stated otherwise, our system is already evolving from a primary purpose of providing thermal energy to residential customers to one of supporting the reliability and resiliency needs of the electric system. Doubling demand and tripling capacity will increase the need for and the value of these resiliency services that we provide. And because all credible models predict an ongoing need for molecules to provide this necessary resiliency, we must decarbonize those molecules and/or manage the carbon that is necessary for maintaining a resilient and decarbonized energy system. The third essential element delivered by SoCalGas's 2045 net zero commitment is fuel flexibility. Gas is the one fuel in use in every sector of the economy: electric generation, residential, commercial, industry, and transportation. Beyond gas's exceptional ability to store dispatchable energy for long periods of time, its unique ability to deliver heat is vital to industrial processes and industrial jobs. In California, this manufacturing and industrial segment is sometimes referred to as the hard to electrify or abate sector. But to be clear, this is not a niche or an outlier. This is the engine of our prosperity. Many people don't know that Greater Los Angeles is the nation's largest manufacturing base, meaning that powering industrial activity is not some peripheral concern. It is integral to the health of our economies and our well-being. The net effect is that decarbonizing the commercial and industrial segment will require decarbonized molecules at a massive scale, which clean molecules will complement and drive efficiencies for the clean molecules that provide energy system resiliency. To achieve deep decarbonization, we have the technologies of energy efficiency, responsibly sourced gas, renewable natural gas, carbon capture and sequestration, and hydrogen. And hydrogen is not just in the future, that ship is sailing now. Literally, that ship is sailing now in Long Beach, a California ship called the Energy Observer that runs only on hydrogen docked this week and probably is sitting there at this very moment. France recently ordered a dozen electric hydrogen trains because hydrogen fuel cells are the future of rail. And in the UK, for your home, you can buy a hydrogen stove right now. And hydrogen is prominently next to traditional renewables in the communiques that President Biden has issued with China and Japan recently around climate policy. And because the goal is to decarbonize and not decapitalize, European plans for hydrogen economies are built on employing existing gas assets, utilizing at least 70% of that infrastructure that's largely paid for, just like the SoCal gas assets in our service territory in California. The science and engineering of the technologies I mentioned are largely known. What is not known is time and scale. The choice before us is when these technologies will play a significant role in our energy system. The timing is contingent on businesses' willingness to invest and on policymakers' readiness to set programmatic direction and to channel investment for their deployment. While it's true that annual natural gas throughput will decrease, as the demand for energy continues to increase, the need for gas and gas infrastructure likely increases over time too. And our focus needs to be on two things. First, decarbonizing these gases, and second, appreciating that volume of gas is not equal to the value of infrastructure. This expresses the need for new cost allocation structures that decouple rates from volumetric throughput and align cost allocation with the resiliency and reliability benefits provided by a clean fuels network. At SoCalGas, we have taken the first early steps for transitioning the rate structure by proposing a renewable balancing service tariff and more clearly delineating the value of these services to the applicable class of electric generator users that provide resiliency and reliability to the electric system. And we are considering additional approaches which we can discuss to valuing and ensuring that the availability of resiliency services as necessary for the gas system to provide in the decarbonized, more electrified future. What's important is for policymakers to recognize the integrated nature of the energy system and advance the updated structures needed for a reliable, resilient, and decarbonized state. To close, tomorrow's energy system must be several things. It is multidimensional. It must be clean, safe, resilient, and affordable. These four conditions require the system to continue to integrate decarbonized electrical and gas grids. And we must recognize that we are collectively pursuing an objective, an outcome, a mandatory outcome for which there is no tried and true blueprint, and which requires stakeholders, market participants, and policymakers to work together and use every tool in our toolkit. Let me respectfully suggest that in this regard, the gas system is an indispensable and valuable tool. So I thank you all for your attention, and that concludes my remarks. I look forward to the conversation.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was excellent. So, Michael, take it away.
Thanks so much, Diane. And I'm actually really glad Jonathan went first because he to say, but wasn't going to have enough time for. So if you're all tuning and expecting a point counterpoint, I think that you're going to hear some violent agreement between the two of us on this. So first of all, just thank you all so much for having me today. I'm Michael Colvin with Environmental Defense Fund, and I lead up all of our energy advocacy here in California. And the way that I think about this is that we want to ensure that all customers have access to an affordable, clean, system. And
there are kind of four key words that I just want to zoom in on there.
The access, the affordable, the clean, and the safe. Because each of these are going to require some really thoughtful planning over the next 10 years as we are undergoing this decarbonization transition. The first one that I would like to just spend a moment on is access. Who has access to the gas system? Who has access to a clean electric grid? And what is that going to look like going forward? Who do we want accessing these systems over time? Not everybody is connected to the gas system. Not everybody is connected to the electric system in California. There are huge swaths of the state that don't have reliable electric grid access, and the gas system is their only connection to an energy fuel, and vice versa. And whenever we think about this, we need to think through, well, what is the equity of that community? What is the reasonableness of making new investments for a community that is not yet connected? And what is the reasonableness of maintaining a connection? We're going to have to spend money to provide customers with, continue to provide service, and is that the right level of expenditure? And that brings us into affordability. As Jonathan mentioned and Diane sort of listed out at the beginning of the talk here, there is going to be a transition of, as we figure out how do we decarbonize the fuels that are available to us, how do we do that in the most affordable way that we can? There are some alternative fuels that can be used in the, to a few of them, but they are relatively, and especially when you start taking some of the environmental integrity concerns that are out there, to really make certain that we are having true zero carbon fuels introduced into the system. We're not just doing some paper accounting here. There's just not enough biomethane or some of the syn fuels out there to meet current demand. We're going to have to start making some choices. And whenever there is a limited supply of things, basic law of economics are going to say, hey, affordability, things are going to be higher. How much are we asking to be paying for a commodity price and for that price increase? At a certain point, it might not make sense. And just to spend one more moment on this, the affordability issue has to be taken as not a uniform concern, but we have to recognize that there are customers starting in different places, that a 5% increase for one customer might be the price difference of a cup of coffee, and a 5% increase for other customers might literally mean the difference between, do I get to buy food for the week or not? And so we have to think through the equity of that. As more customers look at the cost effectiveness of how do I decarbonize my home or my business, and some of the easy to decarbonize solutions that are out there. California has all electric homes. We've had them for decades. This is not a technology question. This is a legacy infrastructure question. And some customers are going to be incented to
Have the gas lines going forward.
And if a customer can afford to do that, if they have the access to capital and they have sort of the plan for it and everything else, and they think that their overall energy burden will be less by having those appliances, great, they should make that transition. And the state, through various policies and various laws that have been passed over the last couple of years, have been pointing in that direction. But not all customers can afford to electrify. Not all customers are technically capable of electrifying. There are a lot of customers who are in a rental situation and they don't want to over-improve a landlord's property. Or there are customers who have a specific industrial process or a specific heat process where they just need heat. They need high quality steam. They need useful thermal output, and you just aren't going to get that from an electric unit. And so we have to think through, what do we do for the customers that are not able to electrify? How do we not leave them behind in the decarbonization story? And the flip side of that,
here, which is Typically,
in California, and California is sort of in the leading sphere for other states that are out there. But typically in California, customers who are more able to afford to electrify are going to be middle income or higher income customers. They are going to generally have site control. They're going to own their own property versus rent. And that means if they leave the gas system and they are no longer paying for that fixed asset, that infrastructure that Jonathan was talking about, and that's a huge amount of legacy infrastructure that is in the ground that needs to be paid for, then who is left connected to the system? That it tends to be customers who are more typically renters and are more typically middle to lower income customers. Everything else being equal, that means that the most vulnerable customers, those that we don't want exposed to a rapid increase in rates, are going to be the ones who are going to have to pick up the remaining parts of that fixed cost. So I'd like to highlight something that Jonathan said a few minutes ago, which was we have to think through what are the cost causations and what are the cost allocations of the gas system as we are making this transition. And this brings what I wanted to think through as we're talking about the safety and reliability. So I've talked about access, I've talked about affordability, I've talked about the clean access, and now I want to talk about the safety and reliability. We need to think through on the gas system, who is going to be using the gas system long-term? How do we maintain the system for that need? And that need itself is going to be
it's going to be presenting itself differently than what we have today. And whenever you have a transition with a big legacy infrastructure,
there needs to be a plan going from A to B. That's the best way to get things done equitably. In January this year, EDF released a report looking nationally at how do we do long-term gas planning, how do we do alignments with the gas utility regulatory framework with state climate goals that are out there. And I'll put a link to this paper into the chat in a moment. But it is something that was really designed for policymakers to start thinking out, how do we start aligning where we want new investments, new ideas of the gas system going long-term, and how do we help make certain that the gas utility itself is presenting the vision of getting from A to B. As you heard Jonathan talk about, SoCalGas is really kind of on the leading edge here because they have presented a vision. They have said, they have articulated a vision. And now the next step has to happen of how do we start getting that into things like general rate cases, into a long-term gas plan, into a variety of other dockets.
Where the new investments are going to be, here's the type of customers that we're going to be serving and why.
So when Jonathan talks about things like we are going to be seeing more frequent use of the gas system with more variability for electric generators to integrate all the solar and wind that's out there, we have to recognize that the gas system as it is today is not designed for tons of rapid starts and stops of electric generators. They always thought that electric generators would have sort of a smooth, steady stream of gas with a little bit of ramping up and down as production of the demand system would require. But there's just not physically enough gas capacity or enough gas compression or everything else to physically run all the gas generators in Southern California with lots of frequent ramp ups and ramp downs, absent having really good energy storage, gas storage in Southern California. There's just not enough pipe around to be able to do things in the way that we're going to need them long term. And so we need to think through, all right, what is going to be the new major drivers of investment to integrate all the renewables that we have on the system? How do we leverage those gas investments in the right way? And who's going to pay for them?
Keep those costs in the right way.
And so in my personal opinion, one of the major things that's going to be happening over the next few years is California and a few other states as well are going to need to wrestle with what is the long-term vision of the state for a decarbonized gas plan. How do we align the state's carbon goals with new infrastructure that is going to need to go into the ground? And how do we align it with existing infrastructure? And how do we pay for that in the best way possible? The last thing that I wanted to highlight, something that Jonathan said, and we can certainly talk more about this during the Q&A part or during the discussion part, is I very much believe that it's not about decapitalization, as Jonathan talked about, it's about decarbonization. And we need to think through, how do we honor the promises of the past of what the legacy infrastructure that's already in the ground that we've already deemed reasonable, recognizing that there's either going to be a decline or a shift in the customer base. And then how do we reconcile that with new investments that are going to go into the ground to accommodate this new vision that is being articulated?
The cost recovery, and minimize the amount
of risk that we attach to any investments that are out there. So that way we have the cheapest and most affordable gas system and the cheapest and most affordable clean energy future that we need. So part of that is going to making certain that we don't have any stranded asset risk attached to the system. I will put a link in the chat as well to what that stranded asset report that I wrote a couple of years ago that I think is going to give some thoughts and suggestions of how we handle this appropriately. But I think that there are ways to leverage the existing use of the gas system that can make certain that it is part of an affordable and clean and safe, reliable energy future, and that all customers are going to have access to it. But we are going to need to articulate that vision in a really thoughtful way. And so with that, thank you all so much for your time and attention. And I look forward to some more conversation.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your thoughts. So this has been wonderfully thought-provoking. And so I have a couple of questions for both of you that I'd love to put out for discussion. And the first one is, I wonder what your thoughts are on the extent to which we've actually had a meaningful analysis of future infrastructure needs, not just on the gas side or the electricity side, both, but within the context of resiliency and electrification, but within the context of, say, resiliency and decarbonization. Is there, in my view, there's still quite a bit of work to be done on that and thinking about that holistically, infrastructure as a whole. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and if there is future analysis to be done, what are your thoughts on that? What needs to be done?
So shall I start?
Please.
Diane, it's a really important question because in California and in many other states, we've seen these very informative and very helpful directional modeling exercises that kind of, they basically start with the end state. In California, that's 2045, and they sort of work backwards. And so in many instances, those models are designed to optimize resources automatically. They're to a large extent self-directed, but they're extremely important from a planning standpoint because they do inform direction. They're also limited in terms of sort of what their real world practicability is. And the question you asked about, for example, the resiliency elements of what that system would entail in 2045 is not typically an aspect that you see sort of a formulaic variable within the models in that regard. I could also, express some commentary about all-in costs, for example, on transmission and other such things, but I'm gonna put that aside for now because I want to directly respond to your question. I think when Michael appropriately speaks about the development of a plan, and I would suggest that those plans oftentimes are informed by some of these end state models, that it's important to realize that entails a dynamic planning process. And so what we've been doing at SoCalGas is we've been taking our sort of integrated operational model and layering on top of that different modules that look at the electric system from a pricing and a production cost standpoint, as well as for that matter, the fuels pricing aspects. And what we end up with is, within the context of the loss of load expectation and resiliency events, we end up with a significantly higher need for some sort of resiliency multi-day peak day molecule to be available in order to maintain that resiliency.
Yeah.
And I can say that when we've done that, we've seen, for example, that, as I mentioned, you're tripling, if not quadrupling, the amount of capacity. You're doing that with variable renewables, which are not always available. That's just dictated by weather and seasonality. And we actually see periods where there is significantly more need and demand for molecules than what the system can provide today in order to serve that need. And so what I would say, Diane, is that it's a really important question that needs to be integrated into this planning and plan process that cannot be taken for granted. And we know from the real world data, for example, what transpired in August in California of 2020, basically all of the in-state gas import capacity was being used within our system to serve electric generation, and that's only going to increase. So this is an area that it definitely requires sort of more scrutiny, more analysis, and again, I want to repeat, those models are extremely useful. This was not intended to be a criticism about any of those.
Thank you. So we've had some helpful models, but there needs to be the addition of certain variables, and they need to be expanded upon, or we need new models or more expanded models. I hear this from a lot of different directions that incorporate resiliency and these other variables that you're talking about. And Michael, do you have anything that you want to add to that? I know you had to dropped out there, technical issues for a second.
Yeah, just for a technical issue, but I think it's all fixed. So I guess I have two thoughts. The first one is, we need to think through what is the value of the resilience and who is responsible for it. Is it the utility's job to provide a certain level of resiliency? And I would argue that the answer is yes, up to the certain safety metrics. But there are some high reliability organizations that are out there, whether your family home or big major industry, but there are high reliability circumstances where a customer itself is going to want to make an investment for that extra little bit of resilience.
We need to think through what is being mandated by the state from a policy perspective,
And what are the infrastructure requirements attached to that? And then what are the customer decisions or the customer driven decisions for the things beyond that standard? I think there's more than one way to provide resilience. And if anything, you actually want a portfolio approach, because solutions will fail. Gas lines do go down just as easily as electric lines can go down. Different circumstances will prompt that, but things will happen. There are different leakage situations that are out there. So when you're talking about resilience, I guess I would first define, well, is it a state level sort of minimum mandate? And should we increase that minimum over time? Because so many things are, electricity and energy generally are such a vital input into the economy that we need to have a very high, robust standard. And then what are the customer facing options for anything that's above and beyond that? The second observation that I would make is that resilience over-reliance on fossil. There are ways of providing a high level of resilience, even using the gas system, but that doesn't require the combustion of a fossil fuel. And so we need to think through what is the appropriate amount of infrastructure and what is the appropriate amount of decarbonized fuel that is available for resilience on top of sort of basic usage that is out there. And if there are certain mandates that we're going to require, we need to think through, well, who is bearing the brunt of those costs going forward? The last thing that I would make the observation on, and I think this is, I'm stretching the bounds of your question slightly, Diane, so
okay.
I'm taking advantage of it. There are going to be times where the gas utility itself is going to be looking at a neighborhood and say, look, we are reaching towards the end of expected useful life of this part of the gas pipe. We are going to have to do some major work or
do other things for their piece of protocols
or for whatever else is going on in order to maintain a certain level of safety and reliability, and by extension, resilience. And if it is not an emergent safety-driven issue, if this is planned work that is going to have to occur, one of the things that should be considered, and we talk about this in the EDF paper itself, is there a non-pipeline alternative where we could bring that customer base that was being served with the gas pipeline? Is there a non-pipe alternative that could bring that same level of resilience in some other capacity to the customer that is less expensive?
Mm-hmm.
And going through what that
Oops, I think we.
oh,
he's back.
There for a second. The gas utility shareholders make their money through continued maintenance and expansion of the gas system. Is there a way to reward shareholders through a non-pipeline alternative and still give the customer that same level of resilience and reliability that they had beforehand? And so that is a part of what should be included and incorporated into a long-term plan, and figuring out what the shareholder signal is for that proper management of the system, including a non-pipeline alternative, is going to need to be a part of the conversation.
Well, that's a perfect segue. Thank you. Into another question I wanted us to talk about, which is how do we put a value on resiliency, given that the way our market mechanisms are structured now don't necessarily do that. I'm experiencing it just in both professionally and personally, how very expensive it can be to, for individuals to be resilient, let alone hospitals and, entire communities. And yet it's a existential need, but the way our regulatory frameworks and market mechanisms work, it's not necessarily valued. And you touched upon this too, Jonathan, in your comments. So I wonder if we can dig a little bit more deeply on that. And you mentioned there's the renewable balancing tariff. Perhaps we could dive a little deeper into that, Jonathan, and other ideas for how, just if there's any ideas yet, we know we have this problem. What solutions are being discussed or could even be hatched here about how we, what needs to change, and how do we do that?
Another sort of very forward-leaning question that needs to be resolved. I guess I'll start with a little bit of let's call it an endpoint, because we've been thinking about this quite a bit. So our estimate of the cost of an 8-hour outage in LA County to the economy is $2.5 billion. So I'm just putting out there a couple of data points about the value and the cost of resiliency. I'm not implying that this is what it should cost to maintain resiliency. Another one would be in California, the major utilities have proposed $20 billion worth of wildfire mitigation expenses over the next 3 years, right? So, that's just an indication of what the cost of lack of resiliency is, not what the value of resiliency is. I think we're going to have to wrap our arms around the fact that the structures by which we allocate costs and assign costs are going to need to change in a decarbonized end state. And that is going to mean coming up with some structures that are sort of what I would call cost-based remuneration and compensation for resiliency services. And speaking personally, I just want to say that I'm a strong believer in price formation as I'm fostering competition in any of these services. I do think that, as we've discussed, there is a unique role for molecules in providing for these services. So, on the one hand, we can take it to an extreme. We can say, well, the electric markets, the wholesale electric markets in most competitive regions have a capacity market, which ensures that there is sufficient capacity, and it's a whole compensation scheme that operates outside of the real-time energy market. Is it appropriate to consider whether there needs to be some sort of a capacity market equivalent resiliency market? Thinking about what I mentioned earlier, which is that for every increment of renewable capacity that you bring to bear and depend on, you need a comparable increment of resiliency capability. That's one way to look at it. I'm not sure that there will be sort of the political appetite for that. What I would say, though, however, is that it needs to be put out there, because it's fact-based, that when folks go off of the gas grid and pursue electrification, which needs to be pursued, extraordinarily important strategy to decarbonize, what they're doing is they're imposing the cost for maintaining that resiliency from the gas grid on someone other than themselves, right? So that needs to be thought about, particularly like in California, as municipalities decide that that's the way they should be going. And I'm not saying they should or they shouldn't. I'm just saying they need to think about what the cost implications and imposition is of doing so. Then to get it to sort of a more practical standpoint, if do we want to allocate the costs to the users that are depending most on these services? So at the wholesale level, that's going to be more increasingly the electric generators. The electric generators bid those costs into the electric market. So that would be an indirect pathway for bidding them through. But there has to be recognition that while you're going to see overall gas and throughput decrease, you would therefore see what I would call peak energy rates to maintain the system for when the system is used. Now, when we've modeled that out, it actually has not had a huge impact to overall energy rates, except that it does have implications on the near term to what electric rates may be over that short, whether it's 1-2 days or hours. That's also part of the case. But lastly, Michael alluded to this. There's a whole set of what we would call responsive reactive services that the gas system was generally not designed to provide. Storage is one example of those. Basically, gas is brought in steady flow increments, but yet gas is used in much increasingly peakier increments. It's also not used in increasingly peakier increments. And so should there be some service-based approaches to charging for those valuable capabilities of the gas system? That's part of what's embedded in our renewable balancing service proposal, which I can get into in more detail later. So that's just a few thoughts in response to your question. I hope that they are at least provide some fodder for additional thinking.
Yes.
And if I can just make two really quick observations here. I wholeheartedly agree, I think, with everything that Jonathan just said. The cost of California trying to build out a fully decarbonized electric system, because it is going to increases in demand because of all the electric vehicles we're going to add and all new electric demands from buildings and everything else. The size of the
need to double, if not more, by
2045. And you can add a lot of really inexpensive renewables like solar and wind, and you can add a lot of relatively short duration batteries, 4-hour batteries, to help balance those things out. And they're the cheapest things that you can add. It turns out EDF has done some really extensive modeling work on this. I'll put a link to that into the chat as well. Whenever you have a really cheap resource like that, you add as much as you can. And it turns out price isn't going to be the constraint. It's going to be land use, or it's going to be transmission capacity that's really going to stop you. But if we were to stay on the trajectory of only building out intermittent renewables and some short duration batteries and not do anything else, costs for the electric system will more than double come 2045. And I'm just isolating that to transmission and generation rates. I'm not talking about the distribution, electric poles and wires, or all the public purpose programs or anything else, just like for like. But if we make some other investments into the electric grid generation portfolio and what we're calling clean firm power resources, and that includes a variety of technologies, some of which are leveraging the existing gas system in different ways. Demonstration,
existing electric generators. We can do that same doubling of the electric demand,
but keep overall generation and transmission rates more or less in line with where they're at today.
Yes.
And so some of the investment choices that we need to make are going to be thinking through, what do we need to do to get a fully reliable electric grid? And these were reliability models that we did. So the resilience and reliability is sort of there. And then how do we leverage the existing infrastructure that we have, whether they be the gas generators or the gas pipeline network, and either introduce new fuels or CCS or some of the other options that I'm not going to go into discuss there in this paper. I'll put a link to it in the chat. How do we think of that as a cost containment mechanism against not making those investments? And the reason why, just to
on this,
the sun doesn't shine at night, it doesn't shine during multiple long cloudy days in the middle of the winter. And so a short duration battery is only going to take you so far.
Right.
And we need to think through, well, what do we do for the multi-day periods? If we have 87, 60 hours of that we have to serve electric demand for, what do we do for that last 10%, that last 70, those last 60 hours when we have multiple long cloudy days? That's going to drive a huge amount of investment. And we need to think through, how does the affordability of the system, how can we leverage the existing infrastructure that we've already paid for in the best way that we can? So when we talk about things that sound really wonky, like a renewable gas balancing tariff, or we talk about some of the other investments of these molecules, the reason why I'm really excited about having that part of the conversation is that we get huge savings on the overall expenditures that we're going to need on the electric system to decarbonize it, if we are smart about how we make new investments into the gas system to support that in the new ways that the electric system is demanding. So I'll put a link to that paper that we just and hopefully that answers part of your question.
Yeah, it does. And speaking of wonking out, we have a question from the audience that I want to couple with just a clarification question. I realize some people who are tuning in might not know what the renewable gas balancing tariff is. So Jonathan, if you could maybe give a quick overview to that. And then along with that, there's a question from the audience about wanting to expand on the SoCalGas call for decoupled rates and Scope 3 target that I think was mentioned in your, touched upon in your introductory comments. And will we see SoCalGas promoting natural gas alternatives, reducing their gas demand in that scenario? So, Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about what is the renewable gas balancing tariff, and then address this person's questions.
So I'll start with the renewable balancing service tariff. initially this idea came out of a paper that Inga put forth around pipelines and decarbonization, and the foundation of the concept was that the primary currency in the gas market, the way that gas is transacted, this is from the producer all the way through to the end user, is in ratable quantities. Even the gas distribution utilities tariffs require everyone except for the residential customers to bring gas on and use gas at a steady state. And of course, the reality is that not only is that not happening in practice, but the use of gas is becoming peakier as we put more renewables on and for other reasons and for other alternatives. So the Inga starting point was, well, this demands a separate set of services, and in many instances will demand additional infrastructure, whether it's compression, storage, or pipeline infrastructure. And so if that's the way the marketplace is going to go, we need to have a structure for it to be compensated and charged for. So in SoCalGas's service territory, the same concept applies because frankly, this is also the case with our colleagues at PG&E, is that we operate basically wholesale transmission level systems as well as retail distribution level systems. And we're increasingly seeing this trend line, particularly from our electric generator customers, who are the largest volumetric customer on our system, where they're becoming increasingly peaky. In general, their capacity factors are decreasing over the course of the year, but their peak day volumes and flows are increasing. And I would add to that, which something I mentioned earlier, that when the electric generator, the gas-fired generator goes off because solar in particular is ramping up and they're bringing gas in ratable quantities, you need to have a place to put the gas, otherwise they need to continue to burn it. As a sidebar, let me say, you wouldn't have any renewable deployment in California if there wasn't the ability for that service to take place. So what we were trying to do was come up with two initial approaches to these services. The first one is from a scheduling standpoint, where we want the generators to schedule a shaped flow based on their expected dispatch over the course of the day. They know it. They know it better than anyone knows it. They know what they're bidding into the day ahead market. They know what the expected demand will be over the course of each hour in the day ahead market. So we want them to schedule on our system a shape for their flow so that we have an indication of what that'll be and we can plan for that shape. And we want to start coming up with structures that can more granularly allocate the cost of meeting that shape. And we have a few concepts in mind for doing that. We've put a few of them out there. Conceptually, one that is kind of early stage that we've put out there is, because we need to provide the same level of service and infrastructure for a plant that runs at a 3% capacity factor to one that runs at a 60% capacity factor, there is a misallocation of costs intersectionally, and that we would propose to reallocate some of those costs. I think over time, in order to get to this resiliency question, we're going to have to shift costs away. Clearly, 70% of the system costs are paid for by small distribution customers. We're going to have to come up with means to be more granular about shifting those costs and be more granular around the variation in services and the variation in ratable takes and usage of our system by those electric generators as a separate customer class over time. That this is not like an urgent, we need to do this today or tomorrow, but we need to introduce this concept so that we can move forward in a rational way to achieve the system needs and resiliency while recognizing lower throughput and a smaller distribution customer base. I hope that's responsive to the question. Should I stop there and we can go to to Brad Neff's question in a second, because I'm not sure if Michael has any reaction, or if you do, to what we put forward there.
No, I think you described it fine. Let's make certain we answer the part about decoupling. And there's another question in the Q&A about
I think he's trying to say why we should take into account the sunk costs for the existing pipeline network when evaluating future decarbonization investments, I think is what he was trying to say when he conked out there for a second.
So let me get to the first question that Brad asked. So first of all, from the standpoint of decoupled rates, all of the rate structure, or the vast majority of the rate structure on the system, is designed around taking a cost and kind of dividing that by the amount of throughput associated with that cost and assigning a billing determinants and a rate on that basis. What I think the implication here is to come up with some value-based propositions and approaches that don't necessarily allocate and connect the cost structure to the volume of the gas that's shipped through the system. This is hardly any different than what the electric retail distribution utilities are dealing with in the context of their net energy metering tariff issues and their need to provide the same level of services, notwithstanding that they're moving less electrons through their system. So to me, what's implied here is, and this is, like, I know in utility parlance this can be heresy, but the business model is going to have to evolve. And there's nothing new about business models evolving. There just needs to be a process for the business models to evolve, and one that's respectful of the regulatory compact. So, I mean, that's my perspective. It's really decoupling the cost structure from the volumes that are moved on the system. The other question around the Scope 3 target, this is a pretty rich topic, and it's one that's worthy of a whole separate conversation because, and I believe Brad is a colleague of ours at PG&E. I mean, when it comes to what we as gas utilities do, we operate as common carriers. We provide a non-discriminatory service to our customers based on a tariff, and we don't really get to control how they, within, for example, what they put on our system other than the quality of gas or how they use their system, so long as they comport with our tariff. I would even take it a step further in California, something that's often overlooked when we talk about building emissions, which is approximately half of the gas emissions, building emissions related to gas combustion are by entities that are outside of state jurisdiction. They're entities that are operating in wholesale interstate commerce. They make their own supply arrangements. They track through our system based on our tariff, and they use the gas the way that they see fit, which means that functionally, to get to Scope 3 emissions, it's going to require meaningful policy support for both bringing decarbonized fuels to market and also creating the incentive structures for the use of those, or frankly, the emission limits for the use of vehicles decarbonized.
For the people who are not familiar with it, could you just tell them what Scope 3 emissions are?
Oh, Scope 3 emissions are the emissions of our customers from using the product that we bring to the marketplace.
Thank you.
And all we're doing is transporting that product for the majority of the gas that's burned on our system. We do purchase the gas for our core customers, but they make up about 40% of the volumetric use of gas on our system. So at the end of the day, addressing Scope 3 emissions will require optimizing both from a policy standpoint and a planning and systems operational standpoint for our system.
We have 1 minute left. And in that 1 minute, well, actually, we have 1 minute, maybe 30 seconds. But if there's one thing that you would say just in a few words that you think is just one of the most important next steps that folks need to look about to address these issues we've talked about today, say that regulators, policymakers should take a look at. Quick, what is it in a sentence?
You want to go
Any
first,
ideas?
Michael? I have them, but let's let Michael go first this time.
Michael, go ahead.
Ensure that your long-term plan in transition is reviewing affordability, clean, and safe, reliable service with an equity lens and try some pilots to figure out the best way to get there from where we're at today.
Thank you. Jonathan.
And I'm gonna agree with that and add to it. It's to recognize that we're in a dynamic planning process that changes based on conditions in the marketplace as well as technology, and to recognize that in addition to meeting climate goals, as Michael just alluded to, we have a whole set of codified statutory goals that we must meet around safety, reliability, and just and reasonable rates, which means that we are in a dynamic optimization planning mode, not a kind of static, here's 2045, here's the one singular way to get there.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. This has been great. And thank you for everybody who tuned in today, and for the questions and for listening, and really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Moderating, Diane.
Thanks. Be well, everybody.